The fluorescent lights of Hartwell Financial buzzed overhead as I sat at my desk, double-checking the quarterly analysis I'd been working on for the past 3 weeks. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, adding final touches to what I knew was some of my best work yet. The numbers told a story that most people in the office would miss, but I saw it clearly. A pattern of market inefficiencies that could save our clients millions. "Hadley, can I see you for a moment?" My boss, Richard Caldwell, stood in the doorway of his corner office, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 45, Richard had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of old-school networking and an ability to take credit for other people's ideas. I'd learned this the hard way during my 2 years at the firm. I saved my work and walked across the gray carpeted floor, past the cubicles where my colleagues hunched over their computers, probably working on their own versions of the same analysis. The Seattle skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Mount Rainier visible in the distance despite the typical October drizzle. "Close the door," Richard said, settling into his leather chair. His office was a shrine to his ego. Diplomas from state schools, photographs with local politicians, and a putting green that he used more than his actual golf clubs. "I wanted to talk to you about the Whitmore Industries presentation tomorrow." My heart skipped. Whitmore Industries was our biggest potential client, worth over $50 million in annual revenue. I'd been preparing for this meeting for months, ever since Richard assigned me to research their market position and identify opportunities for growth. "I'm ready," I said, sitting across from his mahogany desk. "The analysis shows some fascinating patterns in their supply chain that we could leverage to—" "That's what I wanted to discuss." Richard leaned back, his hands clasped behind his head. "I've been thinking about the team composition for tomorrow's call. It's going to be a high-stakes conversation with some very important people, including David Whitmore himself." David Whitmore. Even saying his name carried weight in our industry. The 60-year-old had built his manufacturing empire from a single factory in Ohio to a multinational corporation with facilities across 3 continents. Forbes had recently ranked him among the top 100 wealthiest Americans, with a net worth exceeding $2 billion. "I understand the stakes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "That's why I've been so thorough with the research. I've identified at least 3 major inefficiencies in their current operations that could—" "Hadley." Richard's tone was gentle but firm, the way adults speak to children when they're about to disappoint them. "I appreciate all the work you've put into this project. Really, I do. But I think it might be best if you sit this one out." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "Sit it out? Look, you've done excellent background work," he continued, apparently oblivious to the impact of his words. "But tomorrow's call is about relationship building, about connecting with personalities at the highest level. David Whitmore is old school. He responds to people with certain gravitas, people who remind him of himself." I understood what he meant without him having to spell it out. David Whitmore was a 60-year-old white man who'd built his fortune in traditional manufacturing. I was a 28-year-old woman who'd grown up in a middle-class family in Portland and worked my way through college serving tables at a diner. Richard thought I didn't fit the image. "I know their business better than anyone on your team," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "I've spent months studying their operations, their competitors, their market positioning. I know where they're losing money and exactly how to fix it." "And that knowledge isn't going anywhere," Richard replied with a patronizing smile. "You'll be involved in the implementation phase if we land the contract, but for the initial presentation, I think it's better if Steve leads the discussion. He's got the client relationship experience, and frankly, the presence that these situations require." Steve Martinez was Richard's golden boy, a smooth-talking MBA who joined the firm 6 months after me, but had already been promoted twice. He was undeniably smart and charismatic, but he'd spent maybe 10 hours total looking at the Whitmore file. I'd lived and breathed this analysis for months. "Richard, I really think—" "The decision's made, Hadley." His tone became more formal, signaling the end of the discussion. "You don't need to be in this call. Focus on your other projects. There's plenty of other work that needs your attention." I sat there for a moment, processing the dismissal. The rain outside had intensified, droplets racing down the windows like tears. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent in the office, all the weekends I'd sacrificed to perfect this analysis, all the insights I'd uncovered that nobody else had bothered to look for. "Understood," I said finally, standing up. "I'll make sure Steve has all the files he needs." "That's the spirit," Richard said, already turning his attention to his computer screen. "Team player. That's what I like to see." I walked back to my desk on unsteady legs, my mind racing with a mixture of disappointment and anger. My colleagues were still hunched over their work, probably unaware that I'd just been sidelined from the most important presentation of my career. The Whitmore analysis sat open on my computer screen. Hundreds of hours of work reduced to background research that Steve would skim through tonight. But as I stared at the numbers, at the patterns I'd identified, and the solutions I'd developed, I felt something else creeping in alongside the disappointment. Determination. Richard might not think I belonged in that room, but I knew the value of my work. I'd spent too many years proving myself to give up now. I opened my email and began typing a message to Steve, attaching all the relevant files and adding detailed notes about the most important points. If I wasn't going to be there to present my analysis, I'd at least make sure it was presented correctly. The work spoke for itself. I just had to trust that the right people would hear it. The next morning arrived with typical Seattle gloom, the kind of gray sky that made you forget what season it was. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with everything I should have said to Richard, everything I wanted to say to Steve, and everything I hoped would happen in the meeting I wasn't invited to attend. I arrived at the office an hour early, partly from insomnia and partly from a compulsive need to make sure everything was perfect. The Whitmore presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, to accommodate David Whitmore's schedule in Cleveland. I'd organized all the supporting documents, created backup slides for potential questions, and even prepared talking points for scenarios that Steve probably hadn't considered. "Morning, Hadley." Steve appeared at my desk around 8:30, looking annoyingly refreshed despite the fact that he'd supposedly spent the previous evening reviewing my analysis. He was wearing his lucky navy suit, the one he claimed had never failed him in a client meeting. "Thanks for all the documentation. Really thorough stuff. Did you have a chance to review the supply chain analysis?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "Because that's where the biggest opportunities are, and if Whitmore asks about specific facilities, I've got it covered," Steve interrupted with a confident smile. Richard briefed me on the key points. "We're focusing on the big picture stuff, growth strategy, market positioning, that sort of thing. The details can come later." I felt a familiar frustration building in my chest. The details were what mattered. The details were what would save Whitmore Industries millions of dollars and win us the contract. But Steve had already walked away, heading toward the conference room where they'd be setting up for the call. At 9:45, I watched from my desk as Richard, Steve, and two other senior partners filed into the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see them testing the video connection, arranging papers, and making small talk. Richard caught my eye and gave me a small nod, as if to say, "See? Everything's under control." The meeting started on time. I tried to focus on other work, but my attention kept drifting to the conference room. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could read body language. Richard was gesturing confidently, Steve was nodding along, and the faces on the large monitor seemed engaged but neutral. 20 minutes into the meeting, I noticed a change. The energy in the room shifted. Steve was shuffling through papers, Richard was frowning at his laptop, and the faces on the screen looked less engaged. Someone, presumably David Whitmore, was asking questions that weren't being answered to his satisfaction. My phone buzzed with a text from Steve. "Need those supply chain numbers ASAP. Whitmore asking specifics." I quickly pulled up the relevant files and sent them over, along with a brief explanation of what the numbers meant. Through the glass, I watched Steve scan his phone, then look up at the screen with what I hoped was newfound confidence. But 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "He's asking about the Toledo facility efficiency metrics. Where are those?" I sent another file, this time with more detailed notes. The Toledo facility was a perfect example of the inefficiencies I'd identified. They were losing money on a processing bottleneck that could be fixed with a relatively simple reorganization. But explaining that required understanding the entire supply chain analysis, something Steve clearly hadn't had time to digest. The texts kept coming. What about the competitor analysis for the Midwest region? He wants to know about the Q3 efficiency drop. Something about inventory management systems? Each question made my stomach tighten. These weren't obscure details. They were central to the entire proposal. I'd spent weeks developing these insights, and now they were being communicated secondhand through hasty text messages. After an hour, I saw Richard stand up abruptly. He said something to Steve, who looked pale and defeated. On the screen, I could see David Whitmore's face, his expression somewhere between bored and annoyed. The meeting was falling apart. Richard stepped out of the conference room and walked quickly toward my desk. His face was flushed, his usual composed demeanor cracked with stress. "Hadley, I need you to get in there," he said in a low voice. "Whitmore is asking questions that Steve can't answer. Technical questions about the analysis. He's not buying the high-level overview." "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I already knew. "Supply chain optimization, facility-specific efficiency metrics, competitor analysis, the stuff you've been working on for months." Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. "Look, I know what I said yesterday, but this is about landing the client. Can you help us out?" I looked past Richard to the conference room, where Steve was still fumbling through papers while David Whitmore waited impatiently on the screen. Part of me wanted to say no, to let Richard deal with the consequences of his decision, but another part, the part that had spent months perfecting this analysis, couldn't stand to see it wasted. "I'll need a few minutes to review where you are in the presentation," I said. "Whatever you need. Just make this work." I gathered my files and walked toward the conference room, my heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. This wasn't how I'd imagined presenting to David Whitmore, but sometimes opportunities come disguised as emergencies. As I reached for the door handle, I took a deep breath and reminded myself of what I knew. The numbers, the patterns, the solutions. I'd been preparing for this moment for months, even if I didn't know it at the time. The conference room felt different when I stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of expectation from both sides of the video call. Steve looked up at me with a mixture of relief and embarrassment, while the faces on the screen, David Whitmore and 3 other executives, watched with renewed interest. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I'd like to introduce Hadley Chen, our lead analyst on the Whitmore Industries project. She's been spearheading the research and has some insights that I think will be particularly valuable." I settled into the chair beside Steve, quickly scanning the materials spread across the table to understand where the presentation had stalled. The screen showed David Whitmore leaning forward slightly, his steel-gray eyes focused intently on me. At 60, he had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. "Ms. Chen?" he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Your colleague has been giving us a very broad overview of your findings, but I'm interested in specifics. My Toledo facility has been underperforming for 6 months, and I haven't heard anything today that tells me you understand why." This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. I opened my laptop and pulled up the facility-specific analysis I'd completed just 2 weeks earlier. "Mr. Whitmore, the Toledo facility isn't underperforming because of equipment failure or workforce issues," I began, my voice growing stronger with each word. "It's underperforming because of a bottleneck in your processing line that's creating a cascade effect throughout your entire Midwest operations." David Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly. "Go on." "Your facility processes raw materials in 4 stages, but Stage 3 is operating at only 68% efficiency due to an outdated sorting system. This creates a backup that forces Stage 4 to operate in stop-start cycles, which reduces overall productivity by 32%. I pulled up a chart showing the processing flow. But here's what's interesting. This bottleneck isn't just affecting Toledo. It's forcing your Chicago facility to work overtime to meet regional demand, which is why your labor costs in Illinois have increased by 18% over the past 6 months. The room was completely silent. Steve had stopped shuffling papers. Richard was staring at me with something approaching awe. And on the screen, David Whitmore was leaning back in his chair with a look of genuine interest. The solution, I continued, isn't to replace the sorting system, which would cost approximately $2.3 million and require a 6-week shutdown. Instead, you can restructure the workflow to bypass the bottleneck during peak processing times and use your existing equipment more efficiently. This would cost roughly $300,000 and increase overall regional productivity by 28%. Show me the numbers, David Whitmore said. For the next 20 minutes, I walked through the analysis step by step. I showed him the efficiency metrics for each facility, the cost-benefit analysis of various solutions, and the projected impact on both productivity and profitability. I explained how the Toledo bottleneck was connected to inventory management issues in Detroit, and how solving one problem would create ripple effects throughout the entire system. David Whitmore asked questions. Good questions that showed he understood both the technical aspects and the business implications. He wanted to know about implementation timelines, potential risks, and how the changes would affect workforce requirements. Every question was exactly the kind of detailed inquiry that Steve hadn't been prepared for, but that I'd been anticipating for months. What about the competitive landscape? He asked. How does this efficiency improvement position us relative to our primary competitors? I pulled up another set of charts. Your main competitors in the Midwest are Brennan Manufacturing and Industrial Solutions Group. ISG has been gaining market share by undercutting prices, but they're doing it by sacrificing quality control. If you implement these efficiency improvements, you can reduce costs by 12% while maintaining superior quality, which gives you a decisive competitive advantage. And Brennan? Brennan is actually facing similar bottleneck issues in their Kentucky facility, but they haven't identified the root cause yet. Our analysis suggests they're about to make a costly mistake by replacing equipment that isn't actually broken. If you move quickly, you can capture market share while they're dealing with unnecessary downtime. I could see David Whitmore exchanging glances with his executives. They were impressed, but more importantly, they were convinced. The analysis wasn't just academic. It was actionable intelligence that could directly impact their bottom line. Ms. Chen, David Whitmore said finally, how long have you been working on this analysis? 4 months of intensive research, sir. I've analyzed 5 years of operational data, studied your competitors' public filings, and modeled various scenarios for optimization. And you identified these specific inefficiencies through data analysis alone? Data analysis combined with industry knowledge and pattern recognition. The numbers tell a story if you know how to read them. David Whitmore was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled as he considered what he'd heard. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the call. Richard, I'll be honest with you. When this meeting started, I wasn't impressed. Your initial presentation was too general, too focused on theory rather than practical solutions. But Ms. Chen has shown me exactly what I needed to see. Someone who understands my business as well as I do, maybe better in some areas. Richard was nodding vigorously. Hadley is one of our most talented analysts. I'm not finished, David Whitmore interrupted. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that I've been in manufacturing for 35 years. I've heard hundreds of presentations from consultants who promise the world and deliver footnotes. But you've shown me problems I didn't even know I had. And more importantly, you've shown me how to solve them. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine through the screen. I'm prepared to move forward with Hartwell Financial, but I have one condition. Ms. Chen leads the implementation team. I want her involved in every aspect of this project, from planning to execution. She's earned the right to see this through. I felt a surge of validation that was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just professional recognition. It was acknowledgement that my work, my insights, my months of preparation had real value. David Whitmore, a man who'd built a $2 billion empire, was specifically requesting my involvement. That's That's absolutely something we can arrange, Richard said, his voice tight with surprise and something that might have been pride. Good, David Whitmore said. Ms. Chen, I'll have my team send you access to our internal system so you can get started on the detailed implementation plans. I want to begin with the Toledo facility within the next 60 days. Yes, sir, I managed to say, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. One more thing, David Whitmore added. I'll be in Seattle next month for a board meeting. I'd like to have dinner with you and Richard to discuss the broader strategic implications of your analysis. There may be opportunities beyond what we've discussed today. The call ended with handshakes and promises to follow up with formal agreements. As the screen went dark, the conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Seattle traffic. Richard turned to me, his expression a mixture of amazement and something that might have been embarrassment. Hadley, that was incredible. I had no idea you developed such detailed insights. Steve was packing up his papers, his face carefully neutral. Great job, he said quietly. Really impressive work. But I barely heard them. I was thinking about David Whitmore's words, about the opportunity he'd just offered, about the fact that months of hard work had finally been recognized by someone who understood its true value. I'd gone from being told I didn't need to be in the meeting to being personally requested to lead the implementation. Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as disappointments. Sometimes being overlooked is just preparation for being indispensable. 3 weeks later, I sat in my newly assigned office, a real office with a door and a view of Elliott Bay, reviewing the implementation timeline for the Whitmore Industries project. The morning sun was breaking through the Seattle clouds, casting golden light across the documents spread on my desk. It was the kind of morning that made you feel like anything was possible. The transformation had been swift and decisive. Within 48 hours of the Whitmore call, Richard had officially promoted me to senior analyst and assigned me a team of 3 junior researchers. The Toledo facility optimization had become the flagship project for our entire division, and I was leading it from start to finish. My phone buzzed with a text from David Whitmore himself. Hadley, the Toledo team is implementing your workflow changes today. Early indicators show a 15% productivity increase already. Impressive work. I smiled, remembering how nervous I'd been just 3 weeks ago when I'd first walked into that conference room. Now I was exchanging direct communications with one of the most successful business leaders in the country, and he was treating me as an equal. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Richard stepped in, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. The Whitmore contract had been a huge win for the firm, and his superiors had taken notice. "Got a minute?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. Of course. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the Seattle skyline beyond my window. When he spoke, his voice was more thoughtful than usual. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I said about that meeting, about you not needing to be there, I was wrong. Not just tactically wrong, but fundamentally wrong about what matters in our business." I set down my pen and gave him my full attention. "I've been thinking about it a lot over the past few weeks," he continued. "I made assumptions about what David Whitmore wanted to hear, about what would impress him. I thought it was about presence and relationship building and all the soft skills that can't be quantified. But what he really wanted was competence. He wanted someone who knew his business better than he did. Richard, you don't need to—" "No, let me finish." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of talented people. But what you did in that meeting, the way you commanded the room and earned David Whitmore's respect in 20 minutes, that's not something you can teach. That's pure talent combined with incredible preparation." I felt a warmth spreading through my chest, the kind of validation that comes from being truly seen and appreciated for your work. "The truth is," Richard continued, "I was intimidated by how good your analysis was. I'd skimmed through it, but I didn't really understand the depth of what you'd uncovered. It was easier to stick with the safe play, to put Steve in front because I knew he'd deliver a competent presentation. But competent isn't what wins the big contracts." "Steve's a good analyst," I said diplomatically. "Steve's a very good analyst," Richard agreed. "But you're something different. You see patterns that other people miss. You understand systems in a way that's almost intuitive. And more importantly, you're not afraid to dig deeper when everyone else is satisfied with surface-level answers. He stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. David Whitmore called me yesterday. He wants to discuss expanding our contract to include analysis of his European operations. He specifically requested that you lead that project as well. My heart skipped. The European operations were even more complex than the domestic facilities, with different regulatory environments, currency fluctuations, and cultural considerations. It would be the kind of project that could define a career. There's something else, Richard said, turning back to face me. The partners have been discussing your trajectory here. We're looking at fast-tracking your promotion to principal analyst, which would make you the youngest person in firm history to reach that level. Richard, I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing. Say you'll keep pushing us to be better, to look deeper, to not be satisfied with good enough. He smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it seemed completely genuine. The firm needs people like you. I need people like you. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 6 months ago, I'd been just another analyst in a sea of cubicles, working on projects that might or might not see the light of day. Now I was leading major implementations, communicating directly with billionaire clients, and being fast-tracked for promotion. But the most important change wasn't in my title or my salary or even my office with a view. It was in how I saw myself and how others saw me. I'd proven that excellence speaks for itself, that competence and preparation matter more than politics or assumptions about who belongs in which room. My computer chimed with a new email. It was from David Whitmore, with the subject line, "Seattle Dinner, Strategic Discussion." Hadley, the email read, "I'll be in Seattle next Thursday for the board meeting we discussed. I'd like to extend the dinner invitation to include a broader conversation about your role in our strategic planning process. I'm considering offering you a consulting position that would involve quarterly strategic reviews and long-term market analysis. This would be in addition to your current projects with Hartwell Financial. Are you interested in discussing this opportunity?" I stared at the email for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. David Whitmore wasn't just satisfied with my work. He was actively trying to recruit me for additional projects. He saw value in my analysis that went beyond the immediate operational improvements. I typed my response carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, I would be very interested in discussing this opportunity. Thank you for thinking of me for this expanded role." As I hit send, I reflected on the lesson I'd learned over the past few weeks. Sometimes the most important career moments come disguised as disappointments. Sometimes being told you're not ready for something is exactly the motivation you need to prove that you are. The meeting I wasn't supposed to attend had become the meeting that changed everything. The analysis I'd prepared in isolation had impressed one of the most successful business leaders in the country. The work I'd done because I believed in it, not because anyone was watching, had become the foundation for opportunities I'd never imagined. I looked out at Elliott Bay, where ferries were crossing the gray-blue water under a brightening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to prove myself. But today, I was content to sit in my office and appreciate how far I'd come. The girl who'd been told she didn't need to be in the room had become the woman everyone wanted to hear from. And that transformation had happened not through politics or connections, but through the simple act of being undeniably good at what I did. Excellence, I'd learned, is its own invitation to every room that matters.